everybody! Today I will be talking about African Americans and their experience in Kansas and the differences between their experience in the real world and the world of Reconstruction. A quick disclaimer, since I am very obviously not African American, it's kind of impossible for me to tell you what their true experiences and feelings were in my fiction and also in these vlogs. So if I make any really obvious error or a really stupid, glaring mistake, or miss something entirely, please do not hesitate to let me know, and I will rectify it as quickly and as best I can. As you all know from my previous vlog, Lawrence was the seat of abolition in the West and a very well-known stop on the Underground Railroad. Also, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, stationed at Fort Scott, Kansas, was the first African-American regiment to ever see combat action in the Civil War. And these distinctions made Kansas a very attractive place for African Americans seeking to flee the racial violence in the South to move and make new lives for themselves. Most of Kansas's early migrants were able to find work on the railroads that were being built through Lawrence and the Kansas City area, particularly the Transcontinental Railroad, but there will be more about that in a later vlog. They were also able to gain work as cowboys. Actually, about a quarter of the cowboys employed in Kansas were African American or of African American descent. Throughout the middle of the 1870s and well into the 1880s, there was a massive migration of African Americans into Kansas from Tennessee, Missouri, and Kentucky. The migration was so big that it was actually termed Kansas Fever. However, in spite of Kansas marketing itself as the greatest, grandest, and freest state in the Union, it was far from perfect, and many African Americans were very discouraged. The Kansas Constitution may have been open to people of all racial backgrounds and ethnicities, but the Kansas residents were not. Kansas was not free of racial violence either. There was at least one recorded lynching in Fort Scott, Kansas. There were also multiple incidences of white mobs attacking jailed African Americans in not only Leavenworth, Kansas, but also Topeka. And many segregation and Jim Crow laws began to seep into the major cities as the 1800s wore on. So although there was less racial violence and less segregation than in other areas of the South, Kansas was far from perfect, and there was still too much for most. I realized through my research that I've actually had to alter relatively few things about Kansas and their policies towards African Americans. I will say that racism is less socially acceptable in Lawrence and in the rest of Kansas as well, mainly because in our real history, Solomon never would have been able to become a deputy sheriff. That's changed, obviously. Same with Jasper. He never would have been able to rise up enough to become the head of a factory as large and prosperous as the Winchester Weapons Factory. People would not have stood for that in our real history. However, institutional racism is still a huge problem in the world of Reconstruction, particularly in the very large cities, but there will be more on that later in the story. The song recommendation for the day is I'm Still Here by Johnny Rzeznik. Yes, I'm well aware that it is from Treasure Planet. However, it is also Solomon's theme for his time in the army. You probably don't see it now, but trust me, you will. You definitely will. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I will let you get back to the next installment.